students, I hope this message finds you well. I'd like to talk you through some of the slides that we have here. This would have been our lecture, our session that we had in class today. What we're doing is tying up some of the loose ends from Monday and showing how we can apply these skills, critical thinking skills, to this new project and to the workplace, to relationships, to evaluating our world beyond. On Monday, we practiced the art of beholding, which is the first step in critical analysis, to take in an object or a subject, to sit with it without judgment, without critique, just to absorb as much of it as we can, using as many senses as possible, looking at it from as many vantage points as possible. And we looked at this Salvador Dali painting entitled Swans Reflecting Elephants. It was created in 1937. So this is right after World War I, but before the beginnings of World War II. So we're in a place in Europe of a lot of destruction and things trying to be rebuilt in both an ideological sense, ideas and theories, and also in like a physical sense, buildings and actual structures. So hierarchy here is called to question, and Dali does a great job of capturing that in this piece. So critical thinking comes from the word critic, the Greek word kritikos, which means one who can judge and discern, someone who thinks critically. So this is where we take that act of beholding, of taking something in, all of our awareness, all of the possible observations and descriptions we can generate, and finding something to focus on, a discerning point, selecting some criteria that we can use to evaluate, analyze, or understand what is happening in front of us. We are going to be using this word critic and critical in this sense of an analysis paper. What's important to understand about an analysis paper is who the audience is. The audience for an analysis paper are often academics. These are not pleasure reads. These are very in-depth interpretations of specific objects or subjects. They can be artworks, they can be written text, they can be numbers. Analysis in numbers really goes a long way in our field of academia here. So what's happening with analysis is that you are experiencing a whole and breaking it down into its constituent parts and then rebuilding it with a frame of a meaning or a purpose. So it becomes an interpretation with a lens. Okay, it's multifocal. You have to be able to strip it down to its details, but you can't leave all the screws and bolts outside the package. You've got to find a way to build it back in your interpretation, to reconstruct it. And by having a strong sense of a thesis statement or a focus or a purpose, you'll be able to do that. Critical thinking actually has three different components to it. It has the analysis, the synthesis, and the evaluation. In the act of analysis, you're breaking something down into its constituent parts and elements. You're pulling things apart, numbers, words, shapes, colors. In the synthesis part, you're putting those elements back together, reorganizing them to create something new. You're making interpretations. You're acknowledging the implications of something. You're drawing conclusions based on the evidence you've unpacked. The evaluation part of this comes in when you are judging it according to a set of criteria. So you have to know what your criteria is in order to make a proper evaluation. So when you're enacting this critical analysis paper, you will be tasked with coming up with criteria you want to look at. The criteria we're going to use will be binaries for this paper, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. The first step of critical analysis is to behold. What do I see? What do I notice? Where is my attention drawn? In class the other day, Alexis noted that we had the shape of the swan and its coloring, and then we were able to determine that yes, it was a swan based on our observations. The long curved hook shape part of the painting was a neck. The wide fanning feathers, the body. We noticed that the color of this object was white, that it was, it was part of a lightness. And then we looked at the interpretations. Yes, it's the swan. An interpretation of swan, what a swan carries as an idea, as a symbol, is youth, something distinguished, something powerful, something graceful. beauty, royalty, power, love. In mythology, this is a little bit of a trigger, so don't look it up if you are uncomfortable thinking about or experiencing or acknowledging rape. Leda and the Swans. Swan Lake is another story of duality. And The Ugly Duckling is a child's story that talks about swans and ugliness and beautifulness. But in reality, you meet a swan, they hiss at you, they're violent, they're aggressive, they're territorial. So while they carry all of these elements of grace and beauty, they also have a very aggressive underside, which is where that power becomes a part of their symbology. We couldn't ignore the fact that there are 3 swans in a row. This idea of grouping becomes important in looking at the text as well, and that enhances our interpretation, adding into these ideas of aging, the life cycle, the priority of youth and beauty over age and wisdom, power and youth, beauty and grace. Looking at the color shifts starts to give us some inkling about where this is going as a piece as a whole. So when we broke them down and we looked at just the first swan and then the swan in a series, those were analysis moments. Synthesis is putting these ideas together. So when we look at 3 swans together, our interpretation becomes about aging and life cycle and priority of youth over beauty in American culture. And then we all had that aha moment of what's below the waterline, and there we go. We see an elephant. How do we know it's an elephant? Long, curved, hook shape. But here it is not a neck, it becomes a trunk. Wide, fanning, wrinkled. These are not feathers in a body, these are ears. Color, we see the contrast of black and dark to the white and light in the previous description of the swan. We interpret elephants as strong, stable, loyal, peaceful, wise, holders of memory. They symbolize stability, wisdom, age, loyalty. In mythology, we see Ganesha, the great mover of obstacles, so something very dependable about them. In experience, they're peaceful, they're patient, contrary to the swan. So what makes it possible to see the swan in the elephant and the elephant in the swan? It is the horizon line that strikes through that center of the painting. It is the water, it is a mirror, it is a reflecting point. So now we have these 2 images leveraged against one another. In analysis, we break them down into their constituent parts. In synthesis, we look at them together to figure out what is the meaning of this. Why would anybody do this, Salvador Dali? What are you doing here, friend? And that's where we start to build our analysis and synthesis. Are the swans seeing elephants in their reflection? Are we seeing the elephant in the swan and the swan in the elephant? What does the mirror or the horizon line do to shape our perception of this image? How do we reconcile these 2 different objects or subjects in our mind? How do we hold them both at the same time? How does our interpretation expand and shift when we put the pieces all together? Swan over here, elephant over there, water through the middle. This is the shift from beholding all of our observations to the act of analysis, breaking down and describing the parts, to now synthesis, putting them back together to interpret the piece as a whole, to figure out what its purpose is. Now we're going to add in the next element, which is evaluation. This is where we ask ourselves what we need to know about the value. What is it that we are valuing? What are we measuring, assuming, asking of the piece? This is where audience, context, and writing situation become important. If your purpose is to buy like a nice painting to hang on your wall that you think you'd like to look about while you're lying in your bed, then you can evaluate based on I like it, I don't like it. And those are completely valid criteria for making that decision. If you're the art dealer, the one selling this painting, you might say which one is sellable and which one is not sellable. Which one will have the highest price ticket and which one will not. And then you will come up with criteria that help you make that evaluation. But if you are a scholar, a cultural critic, that's the role that we are playing in this class, then we'll say it speaks to this theme or it does not speak to that theme. It changes the way I perceive the world or it does not change the way I perceive the world. It challenges or confronts a stereotype or binary, or it does not challenge or confront a stereotype or binary. It takes a stereotype and binary and dismantles it, dissolves it, makes it seem irrelevant, finds a new way of looking, reconstructs something, or it does not. It just perpetuates it. And you'll notice that is oftentimes the biggest difference between art and entertainment. Art, when done successfully through the and I'll be very transparent here, through the lens of Trungpa Rinpoche, who's a lineage of contemplative poetics that I follow, that art that dehabituates, that makes us stop, look again at our world or ourselves, is considered art. Anything that does that is considered genuine art by these standards. So here I am even setting up my criteria, my personal evaluation for what is art and not art. Entertainment, on the other hand, is there to create pleasure, to create enjoyment, to create catharsis, to create communal experience. Also wonderful things that people do really need. But you'll notice that in entertainment, those stereotypes are represented because they're familiar and reassuring and comforting and relatable, but they are not often challenged or broken down. Watch a film or a movie and then watch a sitcom on TV, and you'll notice the difference. Now, just because before we were looking at the swans and the elephants doesn't mean that that's the only thing that exists in this painting. There's some kind of wild tangle of trunks and limbs and necks and fans and feathers, all kinds of stuff happening in that lower left-hand corner. What is that? I don't know. There's a bunch of clouds in the sky that are also mirrors and reflectors. There's the color palette. There's so much else happening here, which leaves the painting open for interpretation, right? It's an open text. It's something that we can visit from multiple directions. And this is how we can all be writing about the same thing and have completely different papers and completely different ideas. So it's wonderful. I love it. This is another example of wait a minute, what else could be happening here? We see this man in the picture, if he is a man, I don't know, just do our eyes betray us? We can ask, like, what's up with this dude? What's up with the fire that's happening, the smoke in the painting? What about the creepy tangle? What's up with the color palette? Why these choices, Dolly? What's up with the sky? What's up with the fill in the blank? There are a lot of possibilities here. This painting is rich, and it's something then you know as an open text, you can go in and you can analyze it. So when you're selecting material or sources to analyze, you want to make sure that you're picking stuff that is an open text. It's going to lead to a much richer experience. And for this project, I'll show you 3 different paintings this week and 3 different commercials next week, and you'll be able to decide which one you want to write about. So think about what is open to you, what is available to you, and what speaks to you as you look at each one of these sources. Now, we want to be able to create a common language for our analysis. When we looked at the readings in Unit 1 for the text, we looked at content, which was like the what, the topics, the themes. We looked at form, the how, what types of strategies or devices were being used, and we looked at context, where it came from, when it was published, who was in charge of creating it. We can do the same thing with images. The content becomes the dominant impression, what we're seeing. The focal point becomes the form, how we're seeing this. And the canon becomes the context, where, when, and for whom it is being created. So when you can come up with criteria that are similar between fields or genres or mediums, then you can analyze them together. So we can look at a text like Girl that you had for homework, and we can look at a painting like the Picasso piece we're about to see today and compare them because we'll have shared common language. This is the old apples to apples phenomenon. Now, there are some terms that will become important for understanding this project. We'll do a little bit of banking of these terms. And then after you're done with this lecture, I want you to go onto Blackboard and fill in those definitions just so you can test yourself and make sure you understand the distinctions and how they're being used. If you don't understand what your criteria are, it will be very hard to evaluate using those criteria, right? We have to have a stable sense of what it is. The first definition that I want to offer is this term, a binary. Binary oppositions exist, and there are natural binaries, things that exist out in nature, right? And they demonstrate dichotomies. They're the polarities of things, the ends of the spectrum, as you might want to say. Sometimes they are designated with an or for mutual exclusivity. Now, some examples, the sun and the moon, male or female, west or east, day or night, father or mother, north, south, good, bad, right, wrong, us, them, I, you, self, other. Now, none of these binaries inherently carries privilege. Unless we take the binary and we put it in a culture or an ideology or a system, any structure that has a hierarchy. Hierarchy means somebody's on top and somebody's on the bottom. An idea is on top or an idea is on the bottom. So any type of hierarchy will have a privilege. And when something has privilege, we have to pay attention to it. So this or becomes a challenge, right? If you want to dissolve a binary, you have to figure out the conversation in which it occurs where you can see one inside of the other. Can you think of a time where both the sun and the moon exists, where it is both night and day at the same time? It exists. It's dusk or it's dawn, right? So we have these places where there's blending. Can you think of a time where there's both male and female present? We have a whole new movement of gender non-binary, non-conforming people. So this binary is already challenged, and the privileges once previously associated with this binary become a part of that conversation, and they too can be challenged. So we can take these binaries, right, and we can do that. We can unpack them, especially ones like good and bad and right and wrong. Can you ever be doing bad, not the right thing, the wrong, while still doing good? We have civil disobedience. Look at Henry David Thoreau and Martin Luther King Jr., right? Got to go against the rules sometimes in order to create change. So these binaries, they can be challenged, and they should be challenged, right? Okay. Structuralism is the cultural theory that uses binary opposition to demonstrate how knowledge systems are created. These are just called natural binaries. It's like when you want to tell someone how to make a right-hand turn, you say don't go left, right? So you have these relational terms, and it's not privilege. It's not like going to the right is better than going to the left in that circumstance, right? It's just a natural binary. But post-structuralists say that these constructed binaries in the non-natural world can promote privilege and reinforce power hierarchies. And we can see that happening, especially when we think about binaries of male or female, self or other, us or them. These types of things can become important to look at. So a binary shows the two different descriptors for something. An ideology is composed of many binaries. An ideology is a set of ideas, values, and beliefs that is accepted by a society, a class, or some other socially significant group of people. This value system supports a series of norms or definitions of acceptable behavior. Ideology, therefore, exerts significant influence over the individuals living within a society. Once the population has accepted an ideology, individuals will act according to the ideology's norms or risk facing disciplinary measures. So if you're going to act according to an ideology's norms, then you will participate in the privilege of those binaries. Those binaries will become meaningful to you because they will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, right? Who has power and who does not have power. So if you subscribe to an ideology and you look at its norms, you have to examine what binaries they enact. Schemas participate in the conversation in this way. A schema, it's described as an organized pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationships among them. A schema is letting me know that when I walk into a room and there's a chair in front of me, and I lean on the chair and I sit on the chair, I don't have to think, oh, this has 4 legs and it's upright and it's hard and stable and here I can sit every single time I sit in a chair. If I had to do this, it would be completely exhausting. So a schema is me seeing an object once, being able to label what it is, and then when I walk into a space, recognizing it. The schema works until it doesn't. The chair breaks. Now I must be aware of chair breaking, right? So that would be dehabituating my schemas. Schemas are kind of like those natural binaries. They don't have any privilege. They're just a way of labeling and organizing information. But stereotypes are the schemas with privilege because they are generalizations that refer to attributes of a group. So studies of stereotype contain content examine what people think of others rather than the reasons and mechanisms involved in stereotyping. A stereotype that is a generalization of a group of people, we can have this idea of positive and negative, but I don't even think those are valuable ways. Stereotype is a stereotype is a stereotype, and we're going to see more about why. Okay, stereotypes, are they helpful organizers? Do they help our schemas out, keep ourselves organized so we can react and act in our cultural situations? Or are they harmful boxers where they label and limit and stick people? Are there nice and positive stereotypes and mean and negative stereotypes? Yes. Is it okay to rely on nice, positive stereotypes to make decisions about people because they're nice and positive? No. But why? Why not? Think about it. What do you think? Here's a lovely stereotype. Blondes have more fun. This sounds great until a blonde is trying to get a job and is told she is not serious enough to get that position. Yes, this happens, right? African American students are excellent athletes. Well, that seems nice enough, unless the student is not, or the student wants to speak, do, or be anything else other than an athlete, right? So this really relates to what's happening now with the whole shut up and dribble comment. This is disgusting to me that reporters are making these claims. We're actually going to look at this more next week when we look at some advertisements, but it's important to say it here. People think that because these stereotypes have positive attributes attached to them, fun and success, that they are good, but they are not, because they continue to perpetuate generalizations about people, and they can get in the way of anyone who's trying to step out of a box. They box people in and they limit them. Now imagine a negative stereotype. We have all heard them before. We have been at the receiving end of them, and we have been at the sending end. Think of the Brent Staples Black Men in Public Spaces reading from last week. Operating from stereotypes are defaults that perpetuate fear and ignorance are the most dangerous of all. They have been known to kill relationships, careers, and most of all, humans. Think of a time when people are in default situations, when they are in fight or flight mode. Police work, right? Being caught up in a heated debate or argument. People go into their default modes. And if you have never examined your default mode, you are going to operate from a stereotype that could potentially harm someone else. You are going to generalize and categorize them, and you are not going to see the person that is in front of you. Profiling relies on stereotypes, and we need to find ways to renegotiate this. We need to find trainings for people to examine their own bias, the bias that might infiltrate the situation, especially in heightened states of fear or desperation. So we really want to emphasize the gravity of these stereotypes. All right, it's time to lay it all out here. We're making connections between binary stereotypes, ideologies, and bias. It's a big task. Here it goes. Hopefully this will set up the framework for why this paper is important. Binaries that go unexamined and carry privilege perpetuate bias. If you don't look at what you are prioritizing, you are not aware of your lens, of the way you view the world. And you're also not aware of when that lens is clear of bias, and when you're not aware of that bias, you're not aware of how you'll act based on it. The types of people and attitudes and situations that you'll value and the ones that you might underwrite or ignore. Stereotypes are often composed of binaries, generalizations and comparisons, right? So examining stereotypes can reveal what your privilege and bias is. So by looking at some of the stereotypes that we're going to talk about in this paper, you can say, whoa, hey, I kind of do that. Or, oh, no, I never did that. I can't believe people do that, but they do. I hope they're not doing it to me, right? So we can start to look at some of these things. And it's going to be uncomfortable, but we have to do it. It's important, as you can see. Racism, sexism, classism, ageism, all the isms are composites of binaries that carry privilege. They name the type of bias that is perpetuated by those binaries, by that system of thinking. Now, ideologies rely on these binaries and stereotypes to create a specific set of ideals. This is a bias that the group will carry around with it. Systemic racism, sexism, classism, ageism is a product of ideologies that do not check their bias. It is a group thought mentality that privileges us over them. And when the us is in the majority, has the power, it is even harder to change, because you not only have to change the way they do things, you have to change the way they think and see the world. And if the way they think and see the world is working really well for them, they are less likely to want to see the world from the lens or the perspective of a marginalized person. Unchecked bias is privilege. You may have heard the term white privilege. So this refers more to like a whitewashing of things, of going unexamined and not acknowledging that you have certain privileges based on the life that you've lived and the life that has come before you, right? Based on your culture. By not becoming aware of those, you are mindlessly making decisions that perpetuate some of these stereotypes, and it's very dangerous. Unchecked privilege. So when we have privileges and we don't acknowledge them, it will create oppression. It's like the people who are like, well, I didn't know that I was, making you feel this way. I didn't know that I was, in fact, taking power away from you for my own gain, right? That I didn't know. Quality is not good enough, right? So that's something where we have to have a lot of self-awareness in order to figure these things out. Looking at some of these artworks, looking at these advertisements helps us to take a pause and create some of that self-awareness so that we are not perpetuating these things. We are stopping them within ourselves by cultivating awareness. Now here's the big connector. Language and images are carriers of the stereotypes, binaries, and privileges that exist in a culture. And we looked at this from the apple, right? And the very, very, very first day. The word apple is packed with so many symbols and mythologies and expectations and assumptions and idealisms, but the actual experience of an apple can be very different from that. The language that we used to describe that experience, apple, the image that it carried, we think of Apple logos, Apple signs, Apple pictures, Apple icons, right? Carry all that around with it. So, language and images can perpetuate and continue bias, prejudice. And language and images can disrupt, dismantle, or change bias, prejudice. Language can be our friend and it can be our foe. Examination, intention, and awareness is the most important part of this. We need to mean what we say and say what we mean. From our common everyday interactions to when we're standing on larger stages of power and rhetoric. All right, should we try this? Well, let's do it. Now, which types of cultural and literary theorists would benefit from exposing, decentering, or dismantling binary oppositions and ideologies? In gender and queer studies, this is what we do. Postmodernism attempts to look at this. Postcolonialism, existentialism and nihilism, Marxism, feminism, the poetry movements of the conceptualists, the eco-poetics, the somatic poetics, the language poetics, our philosophers, Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, Hegel, they're all trying to dismantle these binaries because they recognize what unchecked power can do to people. So this slide has a little bit of a background about the structuralists and the post-structuralists. I'm going to let it just lie here. And if you want to ask me some questions about it, we can get into it. But this is actually some grad level stuff. So I'll let you look at it and see what you think, and we can have a conversation when we get back to class. Now, this part of the lecture, I'm so happy that we did in class on Monday, because not doing this face-to-face would make it all feel a little bit uncomfortable and out of context. We talked a little bit about Nietzsche making the claim, God is dead, and what it did for people in that time, how it put them in a complete uproar, but how it lets us look at binary thinking and how that functions. So in the 1800s, when Nietzsche is posing this theory of removing God from the conversation, from theory and philosophy, he's exposing a lot about Western civilization. So when we put God over man, when God is there to guide and support and direct and essentially hierarchically have power over man, we create that first binary. And all of these binaries then fall in suit. So in the 1800s, these are the relationships that existed. That everything that is on top of those blue line was privileged, and everything on the bottom was a subordinate, right? So we've got the dominant and the subordinate. We've got the oppressed and the oppressor. So if God is over man, and man gets to rule woman, and adults get to rule children, and humans have complete control over animals, and humans also have complete control over nature in the perspective of the 1800s. Landowners rule the tenants, masters rule the slaves, whites rule blacks. Remember, this is the 1800s. Educated rule illiterate, rich people rule poor people, colonizers can just come in and do whatever they want to indigenous populations. Look at what the Spanish did in South America to indigenous peoples, and look at what the English, British, and Europeans did to Native Americans here in the United States. Us is always privileged over them in the 1800s. You got to stick with your us. Good is privileged over evil, and that goes back to that religious ideology too. Rational over irrational, right? So all that witchy woman stuff, it's on the bottom there. Rational male thought is on the top, right? And we can see science and religion starting to have a little battle starts to emerge here in the 1800s. War and peace. War is actually privileged because for economic gain and for territory and stature. You want to be a virgin and not a whore in the 1800s, for sure. Married versus unmarried, the old spinster, right? We've got so many stereotypes and tropes that come out of this one. Heterosexuality is privileged over homosexuality in the 1800s, at the time when Nietzsche's talking about this. This is actually something that this binary, you can, if you look at history long enough, you can see where this binary has been examined and tried to have been dissolved or dismantled or taken apart so many times. This isn't, this, while certain religions will prioritize this as a natural binary, it's actually very unnatural to have these two things like this. This is really something that now in 2019 we're finally confronting again. We're in the next wave of confronting it. The civilized over this word savage, right? This city life versus the rural life, right and wrong, us and them. Beautiful is privileged over ugly, healthy over sick, young over old, smart over dumb, and me over you. Here I am, so important. We see that in 2019 too. Self over other, West over East. The West thinks themselves the conquerors, the creators, the big dogs. And once again, that us, them. I can't say that one enough, so I just will keep saying us and them. If you listen to the news long enough, you'll hear that, right? It really works with this whole conversation about terrorism and fear. Us and them is a huge binary that perpetuates that stuff. All right, so this is a lot. If we lump together or group together all the qualities that hold power on the top, it will create a picture of what a society values and what they do not value, of who is in control and who has been controlled. So let's do it. Let's do the lumping. In the 1800s, privilege and power went to God, man, adults, humans, landowners, masters, whites, educated, rich, colonizers, us, good, rational, virgins, married, heterosexuals, civilized cities, rights, us, beautiful, healthy, young, smart, me, self, West, us, people. People who were controlled, people who were oppressed, women, children, animals, tenants, slaves, blacks, illiterate people, poor people, indigenous people, them, evil, irrational, peace, poor, unmarried, homosexuals, savages, rural areas, wrongs, thems, uglies, six, old, dumb, you, other, east, them. Now you can see that as we start to lump these things together, we are creating some pretty intense images that will be carried forth by language and by image over time, and that we must look to art to challenge, to reinvestigate that. We must look to conversations to talk about that and examine that. And it's not comfortable and it's icky. You may see yourself in both of these lists. But which list in that time would you have been more on? Right? Nowadays, do you see these lists still existing? Which ones still exist and which ones have we finally said, hold up, that's not right? Okay? Have any of these binaries flipped? And if they flipped, has that served us? Yes or no? Here's the big question. Do these groups still have and hold power today? If no, which binaries have been questioned, flipped, examined, explored, shifted, dissolved, or dismantled? And if yes, which binaries still remain? What ideas, ideologies, institutions, myths, stereotypes perpetuate the groups that are in power? Which privileges fit with your self-identification? What historical, economic, social, sexual revolutions have happened since the 1800s, and how have they changed the power structure, the rights? Does it still exist? When and where and for whom? Language and money are constructs. The way we think about them changes the way they work. That's from Margaret Atwood. If you take 111 with me in the fall, we do a whole thing about debt. So get ready. How can art encourage us to confront the binaries and stereotypes that our culture holds? How can this examination help to make clear your own lens and bias? How can this be an exercise in dismantling stereotypes, in seeing fresh and new our subjects and objects? Who might benefit from this practice and who might lose out in this process? In this next section, we examine how we can take all of these theories and these terms, these criteria, and apply it to a critical analysis project. We're going to be looking at art and advertising to create a sense of visual literacy and see and re-see our American culture. When we look at these pieces, we're going to be doing what's called a deep reading and a close reading. So deep reading is examining in, and close reading is finding specific evidence that demonstrates what we're talking about. So we're going to look at the politics of the piece, all the ideological agendas, what binary opposites are explored and how they're explored. And we're going to look at the poetics of the piece. That's the literary devices and the artistic strategies or techniques that are employed. How is tension used in context, content, or form to create a space for dehabituation, a space for questioning, a space for re-examining, re-seeing, for waking ourselves up here? We're going to return to Salvador Dali to deconstruct some of the binaries. The first step of critical analysis is to behold. What do I see? What do I notice? Where is my attention drawn? And we did that the other day. These slides should look a little familiar. The second step of critical analysis is to select your criteria. So that's where we're going to be using those binaries as our criteria to evaluate what we see. You're going to look at your observations and ask yourself, which binaries exist in the content that I have gathered? You're going to list those binaries and stereotypes and symbols and myths that you notice in your observations. You're going to start to categorize them, to chunk them. So when we look at our observations from the other day of the swan and we look at our observations of the elephant, we're using the horizon line as our binary line, as the line that draws the privilege. What is on top of the painting is privileged. What is on the bottom is not. And then, oh, Dolly, what do you do with this privilege? How does that line become either dismantled and dissolved and blurred, or is it flipped, or does it stand true? And we are perpetuating these things. So on the top of the binary line, we have the swan, which is equal to beauty, light, white, grace, youth, dominance. The counterparts for those, the binaries for those, elephant, ugly, dark, non-white, heavy, old, subordinate. Now the third step of this critical analysis, after we've come up with our criteria that matches our observations, is to analyze it, break it down, and synthesize it, put it back together. So here's a little piece that I wrote up using those qualities, and I'm going to show you how to cultivate this from your evidence organizer. By using the horizon line, the water as a mirror, Salvador Dali creates a natural binary in the composition. It is in this division that Dali invites coupling, twinning, reflection. The long curved hooks become at once neck and trunk. The wide spanning fans become at once wingspan and ears. Dead trees reaching from darkness into light become trees and legs. The important element to stress here is the and. The water is what provides this context. It is in the swans reflected as elephants and the elephants reflected in swan that I can see how Dali dissolves, blurs the line between beauty, ugly, light, dark, white, non-white, grace, heavy, young, old. There is beauty in the ugliness and ugliness in the beauty. What Dali calls to question is the viewer, the witness, the gaze that enters the painting. Dali calls out you. We've broken it apart, we've put it back together. The next step, the fourth step in critical analysis, is evaluation. Here, surrealism works to expose the harsh realities of racism, colonialism, and ageism that exist in Western civilization. Dali effectively dismantles the stereotypes imposed by these binaries by making the viewer experience both swan and elephant simultaneously. And a culture bent on privileging innovation, newness, and instant gratification over wisdom, tradition, and waiting, this painting forces Americans to stop and take a double look. Body image issues, Botox day spas, and supplemental regimes pool dollars and attention. Americans do not want to get old, or at least look old. Beauty is privileged at all expense, at any expense. Dali's use of the water as mirror refocuses the conversation, exposes the issue, forces one to examine self. This can have implications in how we treat ourselves and how we treat others. This painting successfully dehabituates by offering a space for reflection on American values. In Blackboard, you'll see this, it looks like an hourglass, calling this an evidence organizer. And its goal is to help you figure out the little pieces of an analysis paragraph. We read the chapter in your textbook about crafting paragraphs last night, and this mirrors and echoes their claims about the order in which you want to present your information. So essentially what happens in the top part is you're introducing your claim and where it is founded and why it is founded. Then you are demonstrating that claim in evidence. This is where I see it. This is my description, very specific, of that part of the painting that shows this observation. And then on the bottom half of the paragraph, you're analyzing how the evidence fits back into the context of your claim. You're breaking it apart and putting it back together. Then finally, you're evaluating it in your interpretation. Does it dehabituate the way we think about these stereotypes? Does it make us re-examine them? Or does it just perpetuate them and let us keep, living in this way, in this bias frame? In this slide, I show how you can put your evidence organizer together. Once you take your notes, you transcribe them into sentences, and you have an entire paragraph here. You will be doing this for homework with the Picasso painting that is in the slide. So you're not doing it on the Dali one. We've done it here because we talked about it in class, but you're going to apply these very same strategies and skills to the Picasso painting today and to the Frida Kahlo painting tomorrow. Okay? All right. So my notes become a whole paragraph Keeps it very organized. It makes sure I have all of my elements there that I need to have in order to create an analysis piece. Western civilization privileges beauty, youth, and symmetry. By focusing on the symbols of swans and elephants in the surrealist painting Swans Reflecting Elephants by Salvador Dali, this value can be examined. By using the horizon line, the water as a mirror, Salvador Dali creates a natural binary in the composition. It is in this division that Dali invites coupling, twinning, reflection. The long curved hooks become at once neck and trunk. The wide spreading fans become at once wingspan and ears. Dead trees reaching from darkness into light, trees and legs. The important elements to stress here is the and. The water is what provides this context. It is in the swans reflected as elephants and the elephants reflected in swan that I can see how Dali dissolves or blurs the line between beauty, ugly, light, dark, white, non-white, grace, heavy, young, old. There is beauty in the ugliness and ugliness in the beauty. What Dali calls to question is the viewer, the witness, the gaze. That enters the painting. Dali calls out you. Here, surrealism works to expose the harsh realities of racism, colonialism, and ageism that exist in Western civilization. Dali effectively dismantles the stereotypes imposed by these binaries by making the viewer experience both the swan and elephant simultaneously. In a culture bent on privileging innovation, newness, and instant gratification over wisdom, tradition, and waiting, this painting forces Americans to stop and take a double look. Body image issues, Botox day spas, and supplement regimes pool dollars and attention. Americans do not want to get old, or at least look old. Beauty is privileged. Dali's use of the water as a mirror refocuses the conversation, exposes the issue, forces one to examine self. This painting successfully dehabituates by offering a space for reflection on American values. Okay, so here we go. Now it's your turn. Here's your homework. Use the Pablo Picasso painting and try the critical analysis steps. Behold, observe, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate. Select one element from your observations and analyze it. One little piece of the painting, one little element of it. Fill out the evidence organizer using that single element. You can use the Dali as a sample for guidance. This is new and I don't expect perfection. I don't even expect good. I just expect trying. I'm going to give you feedback on it. Just try. All right? Don't get too hung up on it or you won't be able to do anything. Translate your evidence organizer into a paragraph that has a claim, context, observation, evidence, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation sentence. So it's 7 sentences in all, ish. Yeah? Upload your materials to Blackboard to get a little bit of feedback. Here we are in 1907 with Pablo Picasso. This painting is from the Cubist era. I'm not going to tell you too much about the background of the painting because I want you to sit with it, behold it, and let your observations guide your analysis. Trust what your eyes are showing you, what you already know, what life experience you have, what you've read in the past, and what you can bring to it. Resist the urge to look up on Wikipedia, what is this painting about? It will clutter your ability to see the piece clearly, to see what is right in front of you. And it will dampen any urge of originality that you have. Trust me on this one.